Hey, change makers. Am I live? Am I going? Great. I think I'm here. Awesome. Well, welcome back. If you joined me earlier, we had a little bit of a tech snafu. But we are back on, and I want to welcome you back to day 3 of Governance in Real Time, a daily micro training series to help you understand and grasp governance leading up to our leadership briefing that will happen on December 2nd, Govern Audaciously, how to protect, prepare, and position your nonprofit for 2026, because we ain't playing with these folks as we head in here. And I'm starting a little bit earlier. Truth be told, 8 o'clock is when I've been trying to do this, but life be lifing sometimes over here. So I hopefully will post these in advance so that you can see and join live. But if you are new to this series, new to me, I am Nkoyo F. Young Lewis, strategist, attorney, and creator of the Impact Triad framework, where we help you sequence possibility without sacrificing culture, compliance, or capacity. And I said those all out of order. That's wild. Anyway, I do help nonprofits, social justice organizations, primarily their executive directors, board chairs, and senior nonprofit leaders design audacious, future-proofed organizations that can withstand uncertainty. And because uncertainty is our new normal, I think this is an important muscle that every organization needs to flex and to begin to grow and develop. And that especially all of our leaders, if you are running a justice-centered organization, an advocacy org, you're advocating for the rights of marginalized and historically disenfranchised communities, I absolutely think that it's important that you are focusing in, honing in on how you are governing in this coming season. And so every day for the next 2 weeks, I'm going live with a quick, powerful breakdown of one governance principle your nonprofit needs right now, because like I said, 2026 is coming. And the organizations that thrive, that do more than survive and withstand whatever pressures come our way, will be the ones that are preparing for that today. And so, they say preparation is worth an ounce of... I'm gonna mess up the whole quote, so I'm just gonna leave it alone. But anyway, we want to be prepared. It is often cheaper, easier to be prepared and proactive than it is to be reactive. And I say that as an attorney who has practiced in the traditional realm where we sort of wait for the problems to happen and then address them. And I have found that often a lot of these things can be minimized. We can always minimize risk. We can never eliminate it entirely by being more proactive. So if I've mentioned on previous broadcasts that I stepped out of traditional law practice to work with organizations and sort of be a bridge between what the laws require, what our regulatory requirements are, and the everyday realities of running a mission-driven organization. And so I think of myself as a translator, a bridge builder, a possibility broker, and it's my goal that these trainings and any support that I offer to organizations, whether through sort of these free webinars or some of our paid services where we're doing organizational health assessments, an actual governance accelerator, and some compliance support, that we are helping you to build the ladder to connect those pieces so that you have a stronger organization that's better protected, better able to withstand all of the challenges that come with advocating, sometimes in the margins, being under-resourced in these sort of David and Goliath type battles, but also making sure that you're able to get to deeper impact. I always tell people impact is my absolute favorite form of currency. I want to make sure that whatever we're doing is actually leading to outcomes that are beneficial for the greater good of all of us and the future that we ultimately deserve. Well, that's a lot of intro, so let's get into it. All right. I'm going to be honest. Today's topic is probably going to challenge many of us. It does often and at times challenge me because I like to think of myself as a consensus builder. I love the idea of, shared power, collective wisdom as we're making decisions. And I have also seen how that can be weaponized in ways that lead us to be less productive and also maybe avoid some of the hard decisions that need to be made. So today we are going to talk about how consensus is costing your organization bigly. And I want you to hear me out at a minimum, to just hear the perspective. I'm happy to argue about it in the comments with you. I love a good debate, but I do want to talk about the ways in which consensus has maybe been used as a way to avoid some of the more tricky or challenging or complex layers of work. And I also want to name this because I do work with a lot of organizations that have often come together in a collective way because they have not been a beneficiary of the way that power moves, the way that structures, the status quo operates. And so there's often a resistance to models that are deemed more traditional or normative because of the harm that they have inflicted on whole communities. And so I want to speak to that for just a moment. I have a really great mentor and friend who really challenged my thinking when I decided to leave traditional law practice and start my own firm, in that, everything that happens in corporate America and some of these corporate entities is not necessarily terrible. Some of the structure and the guidance and the systems aren't necessarily bad, but the way that they've been exercised and manipulated have not always led to great outcomes. And that's sometimes because we didn't have all the people at the table to make sure that real full opinions were made. Sometimes we shortcut things because of efficiency or, greed or whatever type of thing. But it doesn't necessarily mean that because it is corporate, it has to be bad. And so, with a lot of the organizations that I work with, they are mission first, movement related organizations. They have been building outside of traditional processes, etc. And so they get their 501c3 status, their C4 status, and now they have put on an umbrella of corporate world that they maybe were not familiar with, didn't understand the deep level of regulatory oversight that comes with it, and they're having to translate and hold this tension between being an organization that wants to move differently than how we have seen some of those corporate structures operate, but also having corporate responsibilities because of the legal entity that they have used for whatever strategic purposes was necessary for the organization. And so I like to say that, the corporate structure provides us with the floor, but there is so much room for imagination and possibility and design that we don't have to just grab what was there wholeheartedly before and adopt it. We can amend it, we can revision it, we can reimagine and co-create something alongside it. And so that's also a lot of the work that I love to help organizations do. And sometimes in doing that work, what I see is a reluctance for, or a lack of consideration about how our power moves within the organization. And rather than addressing that, sometimes we lean towards this world of consensus, where we're all just going to make this decision together. So just in case you're not familiar with what consensus decision making is, or what I'm even talking about when I say, consensus is costing your organization. In other places I've said, culture is not consensus. A lot of people be like, that's just our culture. We make all these decisions together. And I'm like, that is a tool. It's a decision-making tool. But culture is more than that, right? Culture is the clarity and the accountability and the values and all the other things that we put together. Decision-making is a way that we exercise culture, but it's not necessarily culture. So when we talk about consensus decision-making, what we're talking about is a process in which a group makes decisions, where they come to a resolution of some sort in a collaborative effort to sort of bring all the perspectives to the table, look at all the possibilities, and as a group pick one and move forward with it. And consensus decision-making absolutely has its place. I think that there's a definite level of importance that's there. Consensus decision-making is a beautiful tool that can actually really help us unearth blind spots and really have a better idea of all of the things that impact the work that we're doing. And when we over-rely on it, it can become a hiding place. What do I mean by that? It's simple. Consensus sometimes allows us to avoid having the courage that's required to disagree, to navigate conflict, and to make hard choices. And I would say, and add to that, not just making hard choices, but be accountable for whatever the result is of that hard choice. So like I said, I work with a lot of boards, and people go through different transitions. Oftentimes people call me in when they're facing a transition in terms of leadership or priorities, and it's like things are a mess. We're in tension. There's a messy middle here. We're trying to find our new way, whether that's because we have a new leader that's coming on and wants to do things differently, or priorities have shifted and everybody is not yet ready to address or pivot. And so we need to figure out how we make sense of this thing and how we create a process to get us to the other side. And so oftentimes with those transitions, those little friction points, there are a lot of decisions that have to be made. And someone has to own the decision and the fallout of the decision, whether it's positive or negative, right? If the decision is positive, people usually are not like afraid to be like, oh, that was my decision, I did that, right? Like we're all easy. If it's easy, it's black and white, it's no problem. We'll just say, 1 + 1 is 2, except for when it's not. But when there's more complexity, when there's more uncertainty, when there's not a singular right answer or a singular path that you take, people tend to be less open to owning a decision. And so we move into places of wanting to get consensus, to gather all the information, to sit together and make something as a collective. So then it's all of us who did it and not any one person that we come down on. And we see this a lot with boards. And there's an aspect of board duties that does require consensus. But there's also a piece about boards and governance that ignores some of the blind spots that might creep up in consensus decision making as well. So I'm going to name some of those blind spots that might pop up with consensus in practice. And then we will talk about some other ways, some additional tools that you can put into your toolbox in terms of how to make decisions and govern in a way that is both equitable and inclusive, but also allows you to make the decision and move the organization forward in the way that you need to. So here are a few ways, sneaky little ways, that consensus masks some issues or assumes things that maybe are not entirely accurate. So one way that consensus sort of ignores or assumes or avoids attention is it often assumes that everybody comes to the table with the same amount of power, and that there are not power dynamics at play that impact whether everybody is going to be able to fully participate and engage and share their opinions and push for a more perfect resolution. And so when you have a board and you might have a board chair or maybe someone who's pretty influential or maybe someone who just commands a different level of power and respect on the board, one thing that happens is that people who maybe don't feel like they share the same relational power might be less likely or inclined or comfortable going against what that person who has amassed a level of power says. And so we don't actually know that we're getting to consensus. We might just be hiding from conflict because of a lack of certainty that that disagreement will be handled with care in that space and that people can truly disagree and have honest conversations. I think the other thing that consensus decision making assumes but doesn't necessarily check for, that you might want to be more intentional about if you're moving forward with this, is there's an assumption that everyone has the same level of knowledge and information available to them about whatever the issue is. I say this, I work with boards a lot. A lot of times things get handled in executive committee. And so the people that are on the executive committee know a lot more than maybe another member who's not on the executive committee. And so then you come with information that's in the back of your mind about things that are going on, to a decision where other people don't have that same frame of reference. They don't understand. They don't know some of the softer touches of things, but you're asking everybody to come together and make a decision, even though there's not the same level of knowledge and information that's shared. One of the other things, the third thing that can happen with consensus decision making is that it can sometimes be a race to the bottom, because we look for the common denominator thing that everybody can agree on, in an effort to try to appease and bring everybody on to a decision that doesn't necessarily mean that it's unanimous, but at least to a place where everyone is saying, hey, I can tolerate this enough to move forward with it. Like, it can get my yes. That we don't actually pursue the big, bold things that might move our organization quicker, faster, further, because we're trying to attend to all of these different needs that sometimes are the result of lack of information, knowledge, experience, and positional power. And sometimes what group consensus decision making can lead to is almost like a group think, where it's easier to be agreeable. You know, we're like, oh, we got to make a decision. We've got 30 minutes left in this meeting, so we have to make a decision. We have to come to something. And so rather than say, no, I'm not ready, I'm not comfortable to move forward, we try to find a way to pick something that's tolerable or agree so as to avoid conflict. And then the final thing that I think consensus decision-making ignores is, or assumes, is that everybody is here with the same goal or purpose. And if you've ever talked to people about why they join a board, there's so many different reasons. People get really honest about why they have joined a board. Some people are doing it to raise their profile in some other ways. Some people are really committed to the mission and vision of the organization. Some people enjoy power, and this is like an easy place to go and like gain power and have position. Some people were like guilted into doing it, so they're there because they just like don't want to disappoint whoever recruited them or whatever. They have a hard time with their own boundaries. So we don't necessarily know why everybody is sitting on a board, but consensus based decision making assumes that we're all there, we're all moving towards a common goal and purpose. And so that's a place to also really make sure that we do have a common goal and purpose, and everybody sort of understands what that is and what we are tracking towards. And I think the other really important thing that it assumes is that your board or your leadership team has the requisite level of trust to deal with and tease out some of these more challenging issues and aspects of running an organization and leading. And so those are not always things that are apparent or present in consensus-based decision-making. And sometimes we don't find out about that until we really get to a issue that perhaps is emotionally charged, perhaps that people have really strong opinions about, that we then learn that we're not all on the same page to begin with, and we find ourselves in stagnation. I know that was a lot, so I'm going to take a beat, but I also just want to add, like there are some blind spots to consensus-based decision-making, and so if we're going to be leveraging that as a tool because we want to have an inclusive and equitable process about how we do things, we have to design around some of those friction points and some of those places that are not as tidy as we would want them to be. And my answer in this season, I feel like 2025 has been a lot about courage for me, and people having courage to say what they truly believe, having courage to sit with tension if they even have to be the person to bring the tension so we can move things forward. Courage to keep moving even when everybody doesn't agree. And that's a piece about leadership that we don't always want to talk about, right? We want to have these leadership systems that are kind of utopic, right? Like, oh, we all do things together. Everybody feels really good about the decisions. We're all really proud of what we've come through. There's no conflict. There's no tension. There's no restraint. There's no loss of momentum. And that's simply just not the reality when you deal with people. We all have different wiring and thinking and values, etc. And we come together around shared norms, but not necessarily for the same reasons. And so it's really important that when we're thinking about leadership and governing in an environment that's going to be even more disruptive and uncertain and unclear, that we build the muscle around courage, around being the odd person out, about being the one that names the tension that everybody is feeling but nobody is talking about. And that at some point, we have to have decision-making frameworks for when consensus breaks down and what we do next. And I know there are a lot of different frameworks around how people move through that process. I know some of the big complaints about consensus-based decision-making is how time-consuming it can be. And so we need to make sure that we have plans in place and that we're actually allocating the amount of time to go through that process. But at some point, and I think that as we move into a riskier regulatory landscape, someone's going to have to make the call. And what we need to do is make sure that on the front end, we're very clear about if there's not time for consensus because there's a fire, right? We're potentially at risk of losing our status. We have to make a really quick decision about leadership because maybe there is some internal threat or other type of concern, that we are clear about what the decision-making hierarchy looks like what happens, who's in charge, how do they have to come to a decision, how is that going to be communicated to us? Because simply, and I mean, I wish it was a different world, there isn't time enough all the time for consensus, and sometimes someone has to make a courageous decision to move us forward because we can't afford the stagnation. And sometimes we can't, and I think we're moving into a world where we may not be able to afford governance that can wait for universal buy-in. We're going to have to be good with sometimes having to make decisions that are quicker, and that's where having a strong decision-making framework that we agree on as a board, as we agree on as senior leadership, that this is what happens, so that we can make sure that we do a couple of things. One, have a process that separates input from authority. And I think this happens a lot with whose role is it, right? Is this the board chair? Is this the executive director? Where do we get input? Who has authority? And actually having a very clear process that separates those two pieces out so that when we have to make a decision, we know how to move. We also need a process that clarifies when collaboration is required and when leadership simply has to decide. And then third, we need a process that keeps the organization moving forward even when the conversations are difficult. I'm a former litigator. I worked with families that had to deal with tension a lot of times, and seeing how sometimes, good options could be placed, great options could be put forward, but because we have sat with tension so long and we have these different feelings and things have been uncomfortable, we can't get to that conversation because we haven't dealt with sort of the emotional aspects of leading and negotiating and making decisions. And so these are areas where, as organizations, as organizational leaders, we have to build that muscle in real time, because I don't think, as I'm looking at a lot of the regulatory things that kind of flash around here, the places where what was once defined is murkier, that we are going to have to be in a place where we're going to have to entrust fewer groups of people to make decisions. And so that requires some trust building from organizations. And there's a great book, The Speed of Trust. I often train around that when we talk about culture building, etc., to make sure that we are actually building the levers of trust that will allow us to move together. But also it's going to require that we practice operating in this way and actually having these frameworks. Indecision is a governance failure, right? We are going to have to get to decisions. And when we don't, a lot of times that means that the system and the structure is not the way that we need it to be, that the frameworks are not in place. I focus a lot on systems and structure and frameworks because to the extent that we can take the emotion out of things while everything is good and put that in place, then we can come back to that when emotions might be heightened, when priorities might be shifting, when things are less calm. I like to think about it for those of you who are in the legal space, right? We think about contracts. And when I worked with businesses and nonprofits, I was very big about have a contract, use a contract every time. Because a contract defines things when we're in our best state. this is what happens when this. If you want to terminate early, here's how this process happens here. These are the processes, like these are the deliverables. It's very clear. It gets so much harder once people have gotten into the work and our people button turns on and we are not as rational as we like to think. There's a lot of research out there that is like the reasonable person is like not really a real person, that most of us are far more emotional and then we rationalize our decisions and our behaviors. And so in that instance, when we have created this document, this contract, this compact, while we were all feeling good, all, level set, our emotions were not flaring, we were in our best state of thinking and being, we can then use that clarity that we provided for ourselves when we are not as clear of mind, maybe when we are more emotionally charged, maybe when fear, uncertainty, and doubt are playing on us and really amping up our adrenaline, etc., and preventing us from really getting that prefrontal cortex thinking, everything sort of happening back in the amygdala and not up here at the front where we can sort of slow down. And so in 2026, excuse me, we just don't have time to be trying to figure it out in the midst of the chaos. And so, that is a large part of why we are gathering in December on the 2nd for Govern Audaciously, to really sit and think about what are the things we need to put in place on the front end so that we don't spend another year like we did this year on our heels trying to figure out what's what, where do we go, how are we moving, what's safe, what's not safe, what do we need to employ, how many more scenario planning meetings can we tolerate together. But we actually sort of draw some lines in the sand for ourselves that helps us to have a mooring and anchoring regardless of what this administration does, regardless of what funding, what happens with funding to the degree, because obviously funding does matter, but it is not necessarily always the most important thing for a lot of our organizations. And so today, this is my invitation for you to just at least start thinking about adding more to your decision-making framework than just consensus, so that we don't cost our organizations time, energy, resources, and safety and security as we're moving forward. This is an opportunity to embrace clarity over comfort. I've had to talk with board members, board chairs about moving people off the board who chronically don't show up, don't contribute, or not really helpful, and having to have honest conversations and help people have an offboarding because they might not feel comfortable to say, hey, this isn't working for me in this season of life, etc. And so being able to get that clarity to make sure that we are holding each other accountable to whatever norms that we've sent out and that we've set out when we agree to be a part of the board, when we agree to be a part of the leadership team of this dynamic, mission-driven organization. And that is an important thing for us to do, to get to the place of being clear with each other, and also building our courage muscle to do and say the hard things sometimes that are actually going to make sure our organization is better positioned to be successful in the future. All right, I think I've gone a little bit longer than I would normally want to, but if today's conversation made you think, made you pause, made you realize, hey, we might have some governance work to do, we might have some thinking to do around decision making, we might need to have deeper questions about whether we are using consensus as a tool to avoid conflict and maybe need to exercise some courage, then let me know in the comments. I want to know if that resonates. I want to know if there are things that stuck out. If you wildly disagree, also share that too. I'm open to discourse. I love that. I think that actually sharpens all of us. And I wish that we got back to a world where there was more discourse and talking about nuance, etc., and that was safe to do again. And I definitely invite you to do that in this space, whether that's in the comments or in a private message to me. And then, of course, if you're thinking, hey, I don't have all these pieces in place, I'm not even sure what decisions are out there that I need to be thinking about. I'm not even sure what issues might be coming down the pike that I need to be preparing for. I invite you to join me for Govern Audaciously, How to Protect, Prepare, and Position Your Nonprofit for 2026. It is a completely free, the cost of admission is simply your time, high impact leadership briefing for EDs, board chairs, and senior leaders who want to protect their organization, prepare for 2026, and position themselves for sustainable impact without sacrificing culture, capacity, or compliance. This is not fluff. It's not a complete sales pitch. This is about strategy. It's about clarity. I believe it is going to be the strongest hour that you share or have in this last few, I totally messed up my screen, in these last days of 2025. And so I encourage you to register today. Again, it is a free virtual briefing. You can go to the link that shows here, go.leadaudaciously.com/govern25 and register today, save your seat, and be in the building. There is a replay, but the replay will only go out to those who are registered. So even if you're not available 12 noon on December 2nd, 12 noon Eastern, go ahead and register and get the replay so you can at least have the information, right? You know, there are a lot of people who say knowledge is power. I believe knowledge applied is power. But one of the things that I can do is help you get the knowledge and think through how you can apply it. So I hope that you will join me for lunch on December 2nd at 12 p.m. Eastern, virtual. You don't even have to leave. You don't have to put on pants if you don't want to. But I hope to see you in the building. And thank you for joining in here. And don't forget to go lead audaciously.